interview with producer-engineer Tony Platt. More info at bullandbloom.com. What have you been keeping yourself busy with during the pandemic?
A whole host of different things. Transferring my CD collection to a NAS drive, that's been an interesting. I didn't realize I had so many CDs, so I've been doing a lot of that. A little bit of mixing for people, just to because mixing something you can do at a distance. Over the last couple of years, I've done a bit of teaching at a university near to my house, and so there's been quite a lot of discussion and soul searching about how things can work. How you can teach students to record and mix without actually being face to face with them.
What's the plan right now? It's not to hold classes, right?
Well, no, they're kind of thinking that we can hold classes, but I'm not satisfied they've quite got a handle on what needs to happen, in terms of the personal protection equipment and stuff like that. I've sort of looked at the modules that I teach and I've reorganized them in such a way that they're not quite as intensive as they were. But whether or not they'll accept that, I don't know. I mean, for a lot of other subjects, they're just moving across to a kind of distance. There's something called blended learning, which is most of it is online, and you have very occasional face-to-face meetings. But it's not satisfactory in the slightest for music production or engineering. It doesn't work.
And so I'm assuming traffic to your studio has dried up?
Well, the irritating thing is I'd only just finished building it. And at the sort of back end of last year, I mixed the first project in here, an artist called Soweto Kinch that I've worked with for many years. I've actually recorded and mixed all of the albums he's ever put out. He'd finished his latest album and we got that mixed and pretty much finished before Christmas, and then just made a couple of adjustments to it after Christmas, and then all of this hit. So I haven't been able to estimate what the traffic's going to be like. I mean, I've mixed a couple of things for people that I've known for years. There's also a couple of students that have come up with some fantastic recordings, so I've remixed their stuff for them, and just to kind of tidy it up, and make it a bit more commercially acceptable. So the traffic's kind of okay, really, but it's there's a strange difference between if you've got the alternative to do things at a distance, you don't mind doing it, but if it's your only option, people respond slightly differently. I think there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a couple of projects that are just sort of sitting on the side. The artist's saying, well, we can start mixing fairly soon, but I'm not sure it's absolutely finished yet. I won't really know until I can go in the studio and try a few things out. So it's unfortunately contributed to the natural indecision that a lot of artists suffer from.
Right. A lot of engineers and producers will just have people submit stuff to them and they'll mix the albums, or were you still out recording a lot?
The studio that I've just finished building is next to my house, so that was really, I did that just out of convenience. But for the 10, 12 years before that, I shared a studio at a facility in London called the Strong Room, and basically I shared it with a guy called Hayden Bendel, who was an Abbey Road engineer, and it was principally a mix room. We did overdubs and some bits of recording in there, but both of us used pretty much the same system, that we would choose the studio to record in with an artist, and we'd go off and do all the recording. Then we'd come back into our room. We called it the shop, and we'd come back to the shop and we'd maybe put some of the finishing touches to it, and then we'd start doing the mixing. And the whole principle behind it was that it meant that we had the resource that the mixing studio presented, and we didn't have to be quite as careful about the amount of time that we used in that very important mixing stage. So my attitude towards it has been that, the way that I work, and I still will work, and certainly with Soweto that's how it worked, is that we do the recording, collect all of the instrumentation and so on and so forth, and then I start the mix, and I will probably, there's 10 songs, 12 songs songs going on the album, I'll probably do a very basic mix on all of the songs. And then I'll send WAV files to the artist to see whether we're going in the right direction and get some feedback. And then I'll start working on each of the songs very, very specifically and get it to a point where I think it's pretty much getting into the pocket. Then I'll send some more WAVs out to the artist, and we'll maybe go through 2 or 3 rounds of doing that. And then we'll get to a point where we're just an inch away from getting the final mix. And at that point, the artist comes into the mix room and we just sit there and we go through the ideas. I can demonstrate the things that worked and the things that didn't work to them. The beauty of it is, of course, they're coming into it much, much fresher at that point. They haven't sat in the room listening to the whole process of mixing. And also the other advantage is that they've been able to review and get a very good handle on what the mixes sound like listening through their own playback systems. So you tend to eradicate that problem where the artist isn't quite sure or isn't quite confident of what they're hearing in the mix room, because they've got a very, very direct and immediate comparison to make with the system that they're more used to.
With your new studio, do you have a board or are you strictly in the box?
So it's a little bit of each. It's a kind of a hybrid, basically. I sort of moved into the DAW mixing slowly but surely. I went through a period, I had a radar machine for quite a while, which I absolutely loved. And that only went the way of all good things because it was impractical to lug it around everywhere with me. And the last thing that went, as far as I was concerned, was mixing to tape. I liked the whole thing of mixing to half-inch analog, 15 inches per second with Dolby SR, and it was just beautiful sound. But that became much more difficult with, less decent half-inch machines being available and no really usable tape being available out there. So what I've ended up with is I have a pretty reasonable sized Pro Tools rig still running off a cheese grater Mac, and that's got the native card, the native HD card in it, and then it's got 2 UA Octo cards in it, which pretty much takes care of most of the plugins. I've got other plugins as well, but I tend to use those most of all. So that main Pro Tools rig runs out through an Apogee interface and an Avid interface into a Rupert Neve Designs 5059 satellite summing mixer. So that basically gives me 16 outputs, which I then come out of the back end of that and I go into a Lynx Hilo, which is a 2-channel converter, and then the output of that goes to a second Pro Tools rig on a separate computer. So that enables me to record the mixes I was recording it at 192 24-bit. I've actually railed that back to 96 24-bit just because there are still all sorts of niggling little things, niggling little problems that I kept encountering with 192. So I decided that 96 was going to be a better way to go. So that's essentially, that computer is essentially my mix machine. It takes the place of the half-inch analog machine. The beauty of it is that it gives me the opportunity to mix at whatever sample rate I want. And I like to go the highest sample rate into the mastering room, because then what I've ended up with is a 96K 24-bit master, which we can use to create CD masters at 44 116-bit, or we can use it to make vinyl lacquers, or we can use it to make WAV files for downloads that we're using as high a quality master as I can possibly muster.
I'm just curious, what were some of the problems that you found at 192?
It was in the mastering stage. Instability. We kept finding a little bit of instability, even though the mastering engineer I worked with, called Ray Staff at Air Studios in London, he had, along with their techs, they had pretty much everything completely nailed, but we kept finding little strange things creeping in, instabilities in the clocking. And the other problem as well is that if you're going to do hybrid mastering as well, so you're using a mixture of maybe, some analog outboard equipment and you're using some onboard digital plugins, there's much less choice in plugins that operate effectively at 192. So once it started to be less attractive. There were too many problems creeping in and compromises that needed to be made, and so I decided that I was being stubborn and pig-headed by sticking with 192.
What are some of your favorite plugins nowadays?
All of the Neve stuff that UA have produced is absolutely superb, fantastic. The Fairchild on the Neve, on the UA platform is great. I love the Sound Toys plugins, spend a lot of time with those. Softube, I mean, a lot of the Softube plugins are ones that they've created for UA in any case, but they've got some absolutely fantastic ones. And I actually ended up working with the guys from Softube to make some of the classic Marshall plugins that they made for UA, and they're now actually selling through their own platform. I think those are probably the ones that I stick with the most of all. I quite like some of the Focusrite ones. It changes, you know, UA will come out with a new plugin of some sort, and I go crazy for that one, and I can't remember what the most recent one they came out with.
Yeah, I thought there was like a new Neve. Was it like a 1084?
Which sort of filled in the space, actually, between what they had, you know, the other classic ones that they had. I mean, that's always been the case with a lot of the Neve stuff, that, you know, you used one particular EQ because it gave you the solid bottom end, and another one because it gave you the sweet top end, and so on.
Are you more of a fan of the 1073 or the 1081? Is there one that you kind of use more, and what do you use it on typically?
I had an interesting experience at Electric Lady when we were mixing AC/DC's Flick of the Switch album, and I'd been using a couple of devices in Studio B, which is where they had the older Neve with the 1073 modules in. And when I moved into Studio A to actually start the mixing, where they got the 1081s, some of these devices weren't working very well, or they weren't working as well as they had been in Studio B. And we spent quite a lot of time looking into what it was. And Sal Greco, who was the tech at Electric Lady at the time, started looking at the circuits. You know, he said there's something different between the circuits of the 73 and the 1081. And he discovered that there's this strange feedback loop that goes from the top of the module all the way back to the other end, which induces a bit of a phase shift, quite a healthy phase shift actually, through the module, and probably actually contributes to the slightly softer sound of the 1081 as opposed to the more biting sound of the 1073. So I'm very much, whenever I'm choosing pieces of equipment, whether it's compressors, equalizers, or microphones, I try to choose on the basis of the personality and characteristics that that piece of equipment has, and what it's going to impart to the sound that I want to get. Like, for instance, I love using API equalizers. I love using API consoles, and the best experience I had was at Dreamland Studios upstate New York, where they had a full set of the parametric and a full set of the graphic EQs, APIs. And I remember setting the console up, so I was using the graphic EQs on the kick drum, but I was using parametric on the snare. I was choosing the modules to give me a lot of effects, pretty much without actually switching them in at all. It was just the way the modules sounded gave a particular kind of effect. So the 1073 and the 1081 are a classic example of that. You can pass something through the 1073 and it will impart a personality to the sound that will be different from the 1081.
And are you using the API, the UA APIs as well?
Absolutely.
Now, before we dive off into the deep end, how would somebody get in touch with you to mix their next project?
On the mixing front, you know, if there's anybody out there that wants me to take a look at some mixing, I'd be really happy to do that. The way it works is you contact my manager, Charlie, and then what we ask you to do is to send a couple of sessions across so I can evaluate it. And then I can tell you roughly how long I think it's going to take to mix it and quote a price on it. I'm happy to advance a discount to your listeners.
Oh, very nice. And what's your website so they can contact you?
Contact through my website, which is www.platinumtones.com. There's a link there that goes through to my manager.
Am I right in saying that you met Mutt Lange at Roundhouse Studios during the recording of AC/DC's Highway to Hell?
Yeah, basically I was introduced to Mutt by a mutual friend, a guy called Adam Seif. Mutt had mentioned to Adam that he was getting ready to mix the AC/DC album, and he wanted to get this kind of real solid English rock sound to it. And Adam said, I'll tell you, the guy that you should get is Tony, because he worked at Islands Basing Street Studios on Free, Mott the Hoople and stuff like that. So he's very much aware of what that sound is all about. So then I got invited to go down to the session at Roundhouse and just meet everybody, and basically got hired.
Do you recall anything about your first impression of Mutt?
Oddly enough, I'd actually met him sometime earlier than that, probably a couple of years earlier than that, because this same mutual friend, Adam, he had a small studio down on the south coast of England, and I used to do quite a lot of engineering there, and Mutt was kind of the house producer for Polygram Records at the time, and he brought an artist down there called Red Hot, I think it was, something he was producing, and he didn't want anybody to engineer the session for him. He wanted to do the whole thing himself, so I just kind of got him going on the session and then left him to it for the day with the assistant. So we'd sort of crossed paths once before, and all I really knew about him was that he worked long hours because he certainly did on those particular sessions. So it wasn't the first time of meeting him. He's a really cool guy. He's a very nice person, so it wasn't difficult to get on with. And the rest of the guys, very, very friendly. Bon was the most friendly. I mean, I'd only been in the room about 5 minutes, and Bon was, well, you want a cup of tea? And so he went and made me a cup of tea, and I just kind of sat around chatting to everybody.
I know you were faced with some challenges on mixing that record, and one being, I think you had told them that next time, due to how Mutt recorded with the separation of things, that he should add some ambience later. Could you explain how you would do that?
Well, it was a technique that I'd used on a number of occasions, actually. It was just simply, I just wanted to have some sound from each of the microphones or each of the instruments bleeding onto the other instruments. So it's something that I normally call it ambient glue. It's what makes up the spaces between the instruments and what helps to stick it together. So it's pretty simple, really. You just choose certain microphones and you feed them through into a pretty hefty set of speakers in the recording room, and then put a couple of microphones up and then feed that back into the mix. It's not that dissimilar from adding reverb or chambers, but it's under a slightly more controlled situation. And of course, it's a lot drier than it would be with a chamber, where you're actually encouraging the chamber or the echo plate to be much more reverberative and resonant. What you're doing here is you're just really adding the sound of the room to the other sounds of the instruments. On Back in Black, I put up ambience microphones, and on Back in Black we recorded more of the instrumentation at the same time than was the case on Highway to Hell. A lot of the things on Highway to Hell were overdubbed single instruments, whereas on Back in Black, all the songs were recorded with 2 guitars, bass and drums live in the studio at the same time.
Was the band involved in the mix of that album, or was it just you and Mutt?
They were in town when we were mixing it, and they would just kind of drop by at some point during the day. It was most of the time it was just Mutt and me mixing, and they would just come down and check out what we'd been doing. How
much of the sessions were you there for on Highway to Hell?
I was only the mixing. I mean, there was still some, there were a couple of vocals still to finish off. I think Beating Around the Bush was one of them. So we had to do those. I think there was a little bit of solo guitar that needed to be dropped in on one of the songs. But the rest of the time it was just the mixing. I think we mixed it in probably 8-10 days or something like that. So I was really only around for that part of the whole thing with Highway to Hell.
And does anything kind of stand out other than what we've talked about?
I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had a great time doing it. It was very much my kind of music. I still to this day think that A Touch Too Much is probably one of the most underrated singles of all time. I thought that was going to be massive, but sadly it wasn't. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was great. It fitted, it's kind of, it sounds a little bit arrogant, but having worked all those years at Basing Street Studios, I was kind of used to all the bands that came in, or all the artists that came in were really good. So I was used to being exposed to great bands, great songs, great musicians, and so on. And AC/DC kind of fitted into that pattern of things. How would you describe your working relationship with Mutt? Is he basically there the whole time with you, kind of guiding, or are you kind of feeding off of each other? I think it's one of the things I I always say is I don't work for people, I work with them. And Mutt was a classic example of somebody that you worked with. So, you know, we fell very easily into, you know, well, what my job was, what I was responsible for doing. And I was, the professionalism that I'd learned at Island Studios at Basin Street, I was able to call upon that because that's what we did. The most important thing to us was to do the job as well as it could be done. And everything else took second place to that. So I just carried on doing that kind of thing. So, for instance, you know, when we went into mix at Electric Lady Studios, I went in the day before to set up the monitors so that when Mutt came in, we didn't have to fiddle around with those sort of things. And obviously he called the shots. The buck stopped at him, but there was plenty of room for my input into things, and he just trusted me to kind of get on and make sure we captured all the things that we needed. I mean, I think we sometimes slightly disagreed. You know, Mutt would particularly want to have the perfect take with the perfect arrangement and so on, and the perfect feel as well. And sometimes you got a take that felt really good but was a little sloppy. And there were times when I'd say, well, maybe if I can edit that bit into there, we can tidy it up a little bit. Would that work for you? And sometimes it would work and sometimes it wouldn't. So it was a good working relationship.
Was there anything you learned from Mutt that influenced the rest of your career?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, he's probably one of the best vocal producers that I've ever come across. And I've taken so many of the lessons that I learned from him in that respect, and also the just general respect for musicians. There was a circumstance we were working on something, and there was a bass player who there was a simple bass part, and he was just having so much trouble with it, and we'd spent quite a considerable amount of time trying to get this bass part right. And I knew, Mutt being a bass player, that he could play it in about 5 minutes flat, you know. And I said, why don't you just play it? And he said, well, I could play it, yes, but it would destroy him, and he needs to play a lot more bass on this album. And I suddenly realized, you know, there's more to it than just kind of getting the job done. There's people involved, and they deserve the help and respect that they should have. You know, creative people can be fairly
sensitive.
Yeah, sensitive, and sometimes they find it more difficult to deal with those sort of situations. So I think you have to be careful. I think, you know, producers and engineers need to put their arrogance on one side.
Wow. And so Mutt would always make sure, no matter what, that person played the part.
Yeah. I mean, you know, he's obviously he's gone through working with other artists where he has replaced stuff, but he's done it in conjunction with the artist. I mean, Def Leppard are probably a very good example of that. He basically led that through one note at a time, but that was always agreed and was understood by everybody that was involved.
Regarding his vocal style, what was it that influenced you?
Well, I think that the thing that I learned was everybody views singers as being slightly difficult and a little bit neurotic and so on. You know, there's plenty of jokes about it. And I think what he taught me was that it's not an unreasonable thing for a singer to be like that, because if you're a guitar player, you can change your guitar strings. And if you're a bass player, you can change your bass strings. If you're a drummer, you can change your drum kit. But if you're a singer, you've got the voice that you've got. And what you don't want is a situation where the singer starts to get feeling insecure about that, because that's just going to introduce more neurosis. So I think you've got to spend a bit of time making sure the singer feels comfortable and making sure they've got the right lighting, they're in the right part of the room, that they've got the headphone balance is really something that feels good for them, and encourage them. And also looking at the way the lyrics are written. Sometimes there will be a word in a lyric that it might work absolutely fantastically from the lyrical point of view, but maybe on a note where it's much more difficult to sing that particular shape of word. So there's so many nuances within the whole process of producing singers. I mean, an example I very often use is that I was working with a singer who looked particularly great when they were singing. You know, there's some singers just look, wow. They switch on, the whole personality shines through. And I kept saying, oh, come out of this, that was a great take, it was a really good take. And they come into the control room, we'd listen back and think, oh, I'm sure that was better when you were doing it. And I suddenly realized that I wasn't actually listening with my ears, I was listening with my eyes. And so I put the singer around the corner so I couldn't see them. And from that point on, I judged the excitement of the vocal that they were producing on the basis of what I was listening to, because after it's a record, not a video. And I found that was a lesson that I taught myself that was important. But it led from learning from Mutt that you've got to work with singers to find out what it is that's going to switch them on, what it is that's going to make it work. And as far as Mutt on backing vocals is concerned, he's got the most incredible voice. The only other person who's got a voice as incredible as his is his first wife, actually, Stevie. When they first came to England, apparently they used to do backing vocal sessions together, and their voices almost sounded exactly the same. The thing about Mutt as a backing vocal singer is if he was in a bunch of backing vocals, you would have his fader almost completely out with everybody else's at the top, because you keep taking him down, and you could still hear his voice cutting through all of the rest of the voices. Quite extraordinary.
When he stacks his harmonies, he's basically taking the chord and maybe doing the first and the third and the fifth.
It's pretty straightforward, really. It's just, big chunks of stuff. I mean, obviously not on AC/DC.
Right.
Those
are pretty raw records.
Yeah, that's edging more towards the football crowd. But
right.
on Foreigner and most definitely on Def Leppard, that's for sure.
When you're recording vocalists, was it typically just you, Mutt, and the singer? Did everybody leave the room?
Everybody's different. Brian, we didn't really have many people in the room, but that was because the band weren't interested in listening to Brian singing one line over and over again. So that was a bit of each, really. But of course, Brian needed a lot of kind of support and help because it was a massive task that he was being asked to undertake. Lou from Foreigner, I'm still convinced there are at least 30% of the vocals on the album were the guide vocals that he did whilst we were recording the backing tracks. He's just the most amazing singer. So you've got different things with Boomtown Rats. Different yet again, because that sort of punky music really didn't lend itself to the incredibly polished vocals.
When you're doing line by line, how do you keep the tape from degrading? Did you guys have like a process to avoid the tape just falling apart by the end?
No. On the stuff that we recorded on 24-track, it was just make sure that the tape that you had was the best tape that you could have, and make sure that the machine was lined up in such a way that the friction was as little as possible and the heads were as clean as they could possibly be. With Foreigner 4, that was different because we were recording, we ended up using 48 tracks. So once we got the backing track down, I then made B-reels where I kind of mixed the drums down to just 2 tracks and the bass down to 1 track and so on. So all the overdubbing was done on the B-reel, and of course you could end up having more than 1 B-reel and then amalgamating it all at the end down to just 2 reels. And then of course when you go back to your original backing track on the original master, it's still pretty much intact.
Was there any difference with getting the right vocal take on Back in Black and Foreigner 4? Were you and Mutt basing it more on a gut feeling, or were you guys looking for perfection?
With Back in Black, it was trying to get the best combination of perfection and feel. With Foreigner, that was even more the case. It was very much the sound of Foreigner it doesn't lend itself to looseness much at all, whereas the sound of AC/DC has much more of a bluesy kind of vibe to it, so it can sustain a bit more looseness. But with Foreigner, the punchiness and the directness, and it needs to be just that little bit more polished.
Knowing his style to begin with, it just seems like so much goes into the details, including even the song order. But he's very much known for deconstructing songs and reconstructing. Is he doing a lot of that with Back in Black? And also, it almost seems like Foreigner 4, you see more of his Def Leppard approach, maybe?
Back in Black basically, there were little changes to arrangements that went on when we were recording them, but they were just during the tracking process. There was no deconstructing and reconstructing that went on with those songs. Even with Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, which was written in the studio whilst we were in the end of the sessions, basically. But with Foreigner, Mutt spent a lot more time in pre-production rehearsals. In fact, I was ready to go over to New York a couple of times, and it got postponed because they weren't ready. So there was a lot more, and then there was a lot more of the stuff that got changed after we got into the studio. But I think you've got to take into consideration there that there was a lot more influence from Mick. Mick had much more of a producer head on him.
Right.
So part of the trick there was for Mutt to include Mick without Mick taking over, but not to exclude him in a way that he felt he didn't have the control he wanted over the music. So, I mean, there were two very, very different records.
It's funny because that first song on Foreigner almost sounds a little AC/DC-ish a bit, but no, they definitely sound completely different. The drums almost come off as a drum machine on Foreigner 4. And I had heard that Mutt liked to do things to a drum machine or a click track first, and then the drums would come in at the end. Was he doing that on either of those records, or was Back in Black kind of the standard approach where you get the drum tracks first?
Back, we cut 2 guitars, bass, and drums at the same time, no clicks.
Which he's known to basically be just an incredible timekeeper anyways, Phil Rudd.
Absolutely. I mean, when you capture a band like AC/DC, you have to capture them the way they are.
So what about... Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Foreigner 4 was a different situation. That was inevitably going to be mostly drum tracks first. But, I mean, there were a variety of different timekeeping methods that we used on Foreigner 4. And there was a lot of editing involved in it as well.
So it's a lot of deconstructing those songs on Foreigner and rearranging?
Sometimes actually just moving bits of tape around.
And what was it like working with Mick Jones?
They were great. Oddly enough, you see, I knew Mick from earlier on because he was the musical director for Johnny Halliday. He did some recording at Basing Street, and I was on those sessions, so I'd met him before. Dennis, the drummer, I'd met him before because he was in a jazz funk band called If that I worked on 2 albums with, and he actually in London, he lived just up the road from where I did, so I knew him. I knew Rick a little bit, and unfortunately the keyboard players, which I did know from King Crimson, but they went before we started. So I mean, it was a cool album to make. It was an album of the time, I think, is probably the best way to put it.
And on Foreigner 4, you had Thomas Dolby come in and play the synthesizers, right?
Well, Thomas Dolby was kind of, Mutt knew him anyway, and he'd been in and out. He'd been doing stuff on tracks in London in the studio that our manager owned. So he was an obvious choice to bring in because he could bring the feel and the technical expertise into it.
Say in the last decade, generally, what's the amount of pre-production that you do?
What, me personally?
Yes, sir.
Pretty much every album I like to do some pre-production. Probably the least that I do is with Soweto because he's a jazz musician, so he organizes rehearsals and half of them turn up and half of them don't. It's the usual jazz situation. So I just kind of hang out at rehearsals just checking things. But the album I did before that was a Swiss-French punk ska band, Two Tone Club, and we spent quite a bit of time doing pre-production there. We actually had a couple of different pre-production sessions. So I was going over to France and spending time with them. Pre-production for me is a really important part of the album. An attitude that I've developed over the years is that I don't view pre-production, recording, overdubbing, mixing, mastering as all separate parts of the process. As far as I'm concerned, they're all part of the same process. And so preparing for the mix starts actually at the pre-production point, because if you're choosing everything from even the amplifiers or the drum kit, or you're helping to choose the studio, the combination of instruments that are going to be on a particular song, the tempo, confirming that the key is the right key, all those little nuances that go to build up the sound and the feel and the texture of a song. Those are the things you get right during the pre-production process. Then that helps you be more creative during the recording process, because you maybe already decided, you've already argued about a few different things and gone through, rehearsed all the arguments that there are for doing it one way or another. So when you're in the studio, you start to feel more confident in the decisions that you've made, and so you're able to develop the sound a little further. And then as you go into the overdubbing stage, that develops a little bit further. And by the time you get to the mix, you've already started to suggest quite a substantial amount of the contributing factors that are going to create the final mix. It doesn't mean to say that you can't change it dramatically or drastically in one way or another when you get to that mix. It doesn't mean that you cut off the creative process, but it does mean that potentially you've given yourself the components to make the mix that you want to make.
Some of the old school guys I'll talk to about pre-production, they would complain that sometimes it captured more of the vibe and they'd go in to record the song, and sometimes that was lost. Whereas, say, nowadays, the pre-production basically turns into the actual song, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've always guarded against, I've actually said it like this, is I've said to people, when we're in the pre-production stage, don't record the album now, please. I've tried that. There were a couple of artists that I tried it with where I said, let's go into a studio to do pre-production and we'll record everything just in case it comes out really good. And my experience with that has been that it doesn't, because you might capture a couple of little aspects of it, but generally speaking, it stops you from moving forward creatively. So I'm a little bit wary of doing that. I think that you have to leave as much as you possibly can open to develop. So you've got those basic components, but you need to encourage those to develop at the same time. So I think that's, I know what that is. The other problem you see that does arise is that you get demo-itis, then you get rough mix-itis, where there'll be a certain point when somebody in the band or the artist says, oh yeah, well, I really like the way this happened in the demo. And you have to kind of lead them through, okay, that was great, but none of the rest of it was. We've improved everything. Let's just work out how we can bring this particular component into what we've done. Let's not just change everything and spoil it for as we say, a halfpenny of tar. Let's try and keep it moving forwards. And it's the same thing with rough mix-itis. If you let the artist run around too much with rough mixes and they play them to all their friends, then you'll get one of those friends who, when you do the final mix, will say, I really like the rough mix much better. And it's not because it was any better, it's just because they've become familiar with it.
With Back in Black and Foreigner 4, is there any difference on the pre-production that Mutt liked to do?
With Back in Black, the pre-production was really just Angus and Malcolm rehearsing. I think Mutt went in a couple of times, but not a huge amount. On Foreigner 4, there was a fairly lengthy period of pre-production and rehearsal.
What were some of your favorite mics back then?
Well, still my favorite microphones are Neumann U67s. Going back, any of the vintage Neumanns I absolutely love. KM56s. I used to love the old AKG D20s, which are not the same as the D12s or the 112s. They were great.
You use those on the kick drum?
Yeah, and why AKG stopped making them, because they were just so much better than anything that's come since. I like to use quite a wide range of microphones, but I am aware of the fact that if you gave me a room full of U87s and U67s, I'd probably end up using more of those than anything else.
You did a lot of those even on a lot of Neumanns on drums as well, correct?
I like them on overheads. I like KM 56 or 54s or KM84s on snare. I really like. I like to have a U47 FET for kick drum. I like the effect that gives, but I tend to use AKG 414s on hi-hats, and I like 451s or 452s on ride cymbals, anything that's bright and needs to be bright and clear. I've gone through a load of different microphones on tom-toms. I like most people,
421s.
Yeah, the 421s. But 441s are great on floor toms. But also RE20s are pretty good, and SM7s. At one point, I almost exclusively would use SM7s on tom-toms. But on Foreigner 4, I actually used, would you believe, AKG 452s. And there was a particular reason for that. I mean, you made mention of it being a slightly poppier drum sound. And one of the things that I noticed with certain recordings that Mutt liked was he liked to put quite a lot of 4K into the tom-toms. And that was always a bit of a problem because 4K is very much the hi-hat frequency, and so it would have a tendency to pull a bit more of hi-hat in there than I was happy with. So I thought, well, if I can actually record something which has a bit more 4K in its natural tendencies, its natural pickup, then I wouldn't have to use so much EQ on it. So I started using those, and I was quite surprised at how well they sounded, actually.
Didn't you use 67s on some of the drums as well back in the day?
I'd always end up using Neumanns on overheads. But yeah, I mean, in the days of only recording drums with 3 microphones, 2 67s and a D20.
Then Brian's voice, which I guess a little shocked just because of the power behind it, and almost seems like you might have to go to a dynamic mic, but it looked like you used an 87 on his voice.
Yep. Yeah, an 87 and an 1176, that was it.
And you printed the 1176?
Yes, just a little bit. It made it easier for him to move in and out on the microphone and maintain dynamics.
And anything else stand out about his vocals for that?
No, I mean, he worked extraordinarily hard with those vocals, and it was a huge ask to do that. And, that was where the perfection came in from Mutt's point of view. He really wanted every single one of those lines to absolutely count. And the typical way that we would record would be to do 3 or 4 tracks of the lead vocal. And each one of those tracks, we'd probably drop in a few words here and there. So what we ended up with was 3 or 4 tracks that in their own right would be pretty okay. And then we would go through line by line, listening, comparing each one of those tracks and choosing which one we were going to use. Sometimes it would be just a word at a time on one track, and sometimes it would just be even one syllable. And then we would go through and compile that onto one track. Something more, something of a labor of love, that, and it's so much easier to do with Pro Tools, but if you're doing it on multi-track, multi-track analog, it's a long, drawn-out process.
What do you remember most about the Foreigner 4 recording sessions when you reflect on them nowadays?
That's easy. Well, 2 things, really. We actually bought a fuzzball table that we had at the back of Electric Lady, so quite often after the session, the music part of the session had finished, we'd have a fuzzball tournament, and I was actually the Foreigner 4 fuzzball champion for a little while. I think the thing that sticks out in my head most of all was the day that we recorded I've Been Waiting for a Girl Like You. And that was one of those moments when we just knew that this was an absolute killer. And I remember Mutt had gone back to the hotel and sitting with Mick and a couple of the others and just playing it back time after time after time. To the point, actually, oddly enough, where I said, hey, we're going to wear this out. I'll just rough mix it, and then we'll play the rough mix back if you want to hear it anymore. That was one of those songs. I mean, I'm convinced that most of the guide vocal was the one that ended up on the album, because Lou just sang it so perfectly. So.
Incredible. And I'm assuming on Lou you used an 87 on that as well, right? On his voice?
Yeah, well, one of the beauties of the layout of Electric Lady at that time was there was this, in fact, I think it's still the same. There's an airlock between the control room and the studio, and it's a pretty large room, actually. So we were able to set Lou up in that airlock so he could just belt it out as much as he wanted to without any fear of his vocals getting onto any of the other microphones.
What kind of board did they have at Electric Lady?
Oh, that was a Neve 8078.
And it was an MCI board on Back in Black?
The recording board, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so both those, are you just using the pre's on those boards to record both their vocals?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything stand out with Jukebox Hero or Urgent? You must have had kind of the same feeling on those, that those were going to be giant, right?
Well, yeah, Urgent was a little difficult because it was based around this repeat. The guitar part is actually Mick playing into a repeat echo, and so that determined the tempo. But the problem was he started using the Binson Echoplex, and it was very difficult with the Binson Echoplex. It was very difficult there was two things that happened. Partly we were getting some distortions that weren't particularly nice, and secondly, getting the tempo exactly right, absolutely perfect, was really difficult because it's a mechanical device. I then tried to set it up with a digital delay, and that we could maybe dial in a bit more accurately, but the sound wasn't as good as going through the Binson Echoplex. And then I tried to do it using tape delay that we could vary speed and get that absolutely right. So in the end, we went the full circle and went back to the Binson Echoplex, and so the tempo of the song was determined by how accurately we could set the Echoplex up.
How has your approach changed from, say, back in the day to now when it comes to mixing?
I think I like the fact that what I really like the most about mixing in the box is that I can capture a mix and then we can just tweak it without having to go through all of the pain of recalling. That was a killer thing. I mean, mixing back in the day was very much a manual affair, and you did maybe 2 or 3 mixes and edited all the best bits of those mixes together. And I mean, I certainly remember mixing dub reggae, for instance, where we'd have half a dozen members of the band all with a couple of knobs each, and that would become complete anarchy. It was fantastic. And the mixes were almost as much of a performance as the music was. So I think now we've got a situation where we can focus much more microscopically on little elements of the mix. But of course, with anything like that, any technological move forward, there are dangers that come with it. That introduces the possibility of people being just so ridiculously focused on something that they lose sight of the bigger picture. My mixing has really developed in 2 ways. It's developed on the basis of the technology that's come along and how I can best use it, and the circumstances that technology is introduced. So I'm very much of the school, the moment the technology starts using me, then I put the brakes on. I don't like that happening. So, I mean, I'm not sure I could put my finger on exactly how it's changed. I've sort of rolled with the way that things have gone as much as I possibly can. I think there are too many people who are mixing engineers and that's all they do. I'm not a great fan of that because it homogenizes so much. There's so much music out there that you put it on and you go, oh, that's such and such a mixing engineer, I've never liked the idea of the production being bigger than the song, and I think that's what happens sometimes in those sort of circumstances. I think that's probably the main thing that has changed. Most of the stuff, from my point of view, is me fighting against inevitably being dragged along by the crowd. There was a period of time in the 80s when I was doing a lot of mixing. For some reason or other, there were a lot of people bringing stuff to me. I mean, I remember one A&R guy saying, yeah, well, we just want that huge drum sound that you create, and me trying to explain to him that actually the huge drum sound is created when you record it, and trying to make a huge drum sound out of something that's not been recorded very well is a bit of a tough ask. And I think that's one of the big problems, is going back to what I was saying before, they're not separate processes, they're all part of one long process. So it's a little uncomfortable sometimes mixing. That's why I say I will always be honest with people. What I'd like people to do is to send me their music, and if I think that I can contribute to that, then I will say so, and I will quote a price on it. If I don't feel that I can contribute, or if I don't feel that I quite get it in the way that they obviously want it to be, then I'll say so, and we either have a further conversation. I mean, sometimes that's ended up with them realizing they've gone too far down a particular route and they need to backtrack and change something, and then we work from that point of view. Sometimes it's an artist actually persuading me of their viewpoint, and I give it a try and it works out where I didn't think it was going to. And then sometimes it's just me recommending somebody else that I think would be better suited.
One of the things that I hate nowadays, everybody uses just sampled drum sounds, and I get it that it's hard to get a good drum sound, but I think that's what aggravates me the most in a lot of these recordings nowadays is that sound, and I can almost hear it immediately, and then I'm usually out.
It's a little bit like we had with when synthesizers first came on the scene, the first DX7, and very few of the keyboard players that played with the DX7 took time or trouble to work out how to change the sounds, to program the sounds themselves. So what we ended up with was the typical DX7 sound, the typical Jupiter 8 sound, and the typical Mini Moog sound, and so on. So I used to just call it preset-itis. Everybody would be using the same preset.
I was just talking about that. That's another one that I despised, was the 80s sound. It's like as soon as I hear it, I just hate that production, and you can totally point to it. Even the Pink Floyd records, there's some great songs on some of that stuff where Gilmour led the band, but you listen to it and they're so dated, where you go back to the stuff in the 70s and it's like forever, the sounds that they came up with.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've suffered a little bit from that, because every record for me should move forward. I've tried not to go back and do the same thing again, and I think there've been a couple of albums that I've engineered and produced where I've actually taken them a couple of steps beyond where I should have done, and so they were, I mean, I sound slightly arrogant, but so we made records that were a little bit ahead of their time, and they didn't fit in, and therefore didn't engage with an audience in quite the same way. I think that's the other thing you have to remember, of course, is that we're making records for an audience, and I don't think it's unreasonable to say that there's no reason why audiences should move quite as fast as creative people do. I think there are always going to be situations where the audience feels comfortable with a particular sound. The 80s is a good example of that. They feel comfortable with a particular sound, they buy into it, they've had lots of wonderful experiences that go with listening to those sounds in those kind of circumstances and so on. And so they don't want things to change. Something comes along that's wildly different, and at first they balk at it because it's not as comfortable as they might want it to be. And all these things is what's wonderful about the music industry. I think if you're given the opportunities to just kind of try stuff, there's nothing better than that. It's an absolute privilege to be able to play around with all these wonderful toys and try different things and so on.